Hello, welcome to the Cambridge Alumni Festival. We're joining you from the rather magnificent Keynes room here in the University Library. I'm joined by Dr. Katrina Dean, who is the Keeper of Archives in the University Library. And we are here for a show and tell of the Stephen Hawking archive, which came to the University Library in March of this year with thanks to the Hawking Foundation, the Hawking family, and the British government. So Katrina's going to take us on a whistle-stop tour of some of the most interesting and fascinating things that she's found in the archive as we've begun to catalogue it. If you've got any questions, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A and we'll answer them. There'll be time for questions at the end, but feel free to drop them in at any time you fancy, and maybe we can pick some of them up as we go round. My name's Chris Burgess. I'm the Head of Exhibitions and Public Programmes here at the Library. I'll hand over now to Katrina.
Thanks, Chris. Well, of course, archives tell many stories. So what is this archive about? Well, you might think, surely this is the archive of Stephen Hawking, a scientific genius in the line of Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin, thinking brilliant thoughts about the universe. And of course, that's one story that might be told by this archive, but there are others that come to mind. An eminent scientific researcher, a successful science writer, a teacher of graduate students, an accessibility advocate, an anti-nuclear campaigner, a celebrity, a father, a son, and a friend. So is it also only about the Stephen Hawking archive, or is the Stephen Hawking archive only about Stephen Hawking, or is it also about the scientific public and fans? And what about human-computer interaction and also the archive itself? So there's many distinctive things about the Stephen Hawking archive, not just the eminence of its creator and his celebrity, and not even just the significance of its subject matter. If you think about it, a traditional archive, it's the original documents in the hand of the creator that are often considered significant in an archive. And while we'll see quite a lot of that material today, I just think it's worth bearing in mind that in 1963, Stephen Hawking was diagnosed with a motor neurone disease. And by the early 1970s, extended handwriting was increasingly difficult. And in 1985, he was no longer able to use his natural voice. So you'll see some of that reflected in the archive today. It's said that it's serendipitous that Stephen Hawking was a theoretical physicist and not an experimental one. But actually, if you think about theoretical physics in the 1960s, even in the 1960s, chalk and blackboard, pen and paper, doing diagrams and formula was still very much a part of the working methods of scientists. And so what we'll see today is how some of the methods that Hawking adapted to work in theoretical physics are reflected in his archive. And that'll tell us a bit about his working methods in turn. So let's go right back to the beginning and let's get into some of the material. So the first item that I have here is a letter from Stephen Hawking to his father, Frank Hawking. It's written in 1948 when Stephen Hawking was 6 years old. And what it says is, "Dear father, here is a story. Once upon a time, some pirates were loading some treasure onto a ship, Stephen." So it was sent, by Stephen. Why was he sending his father a letter? Well, his father was a medical researcher who had trained at the University College Oxford and St Bartholomew's London, and he worked for the Medical Research Council from 1939. And he was working in Tanzania, looking at a tropical disease and setting up a research centre there. The family lived in St Albans, and Stephen Hawking attended St Albans High School, or St Albans School. So moving on to another part of the archive, what we've got here are some group photographs of the University College Boat Club. So in 1959, Hawking started a physics degree at University College in Oxford. And after a bit of a desultory start, in the second year, he joined the College Boat Club as a coxswain. And that became sort of the focus of his social life. There's little other evidence from this time in his life and his undergraduate years. And during his final examination, he was asked what he was going to do after he'd finished his degree. And he said, well, if I get a second-class degree, I'll stay at Oxford. But if I get a first-class one, I'll go to Cambridge. So it was really interesting to see the reaction of Tim Hawking seeing some of these photos, because Tim is Stephen Hawking's third son, and he hadn't seen his father as a younger person, you know, active and larking around with his friends before. So that was really an interesting.
And just on this early material, is there a lot of it, or is there not much stuff, or was he a keeper of an archive before he realised he needed to keep an archive?
I don't think so. I don't think there's a great deal of material, and you know that's pretty common with most scientists. They don't tend to start keeping their archive, you know, in their early research years and before. But you know, some people are hoarders, and some people are not hoarders. I found other letters, you know, from other scientists from their early days, and they've kept all their school notebooks and their, you know, essays and things like that, but not this one. Okay, so Stephen Hawking did come on to carry out his PhD research at the University of Cambridge, and he wanted to work with a very well-known astronomer and cosmologist, Fred Hoyle, who was also a great popularizer of science. But Hawking was assigned to Dennis Sciama, and he joined a team of doctoral researchers, including Brandon Carter and George Ellis, and Martin Rees, who's the Astronomer Royal, and we know him well in Cambridge, later joined this group. So in this letter, which is here, Sciama is actually writing to Hawking's dad again, so Frank Hawking again, and saying that you know, he's doing really well with his research, and that Sciama is also learning from Hawking. So that's fantastic. And the PhD thesis that Hawking submitted is now preserved in Cambridge University Library. And when it was made available online in 2017, the large number of people trying to access it nearly crashed the servers. And you can look that up in the digital library if you want to see that online.
And just was his supervisor writing to his father because he knew him, or just because I can't imagine my PhD supervisor writing to my dad, though perhaps it would have made me do more work. But why that letter? Do we know? I
think it probably, well, I'm only conjecturing here, and it's in very early stages of putting the archive together, but I suppose perhaps because of the motor neurone diagnosis, there'd been some discussion between his supervisor and his family about how it was going to go and would they keep going, and maybe this is just a reassuring letter saying actually it's going along and it's working out.
That's good.
Yeah. But that's, you know, just my idea. So a bit later then, Hawking, he completed his PhD and he applied for a research fellowship at Gonville and Keyes College, which is one of the colleges here in Cambridge. And he asked one of the leading theoretical physicists of the day, Hermann Bondi, to be a referee, and they met at a seminar. Bondi actually forgot that Hawking had made this request. So when the college contacted him to give reference on this young person, he didn't really know who Hawking was. But the documents in the archives show that Hawking wrote to Bondi, enclosing some of his papers and research papers, which were then later returned to Hawking. And there's a note from Bondi's secretary confirming Bondi had spoken with the college. And this is the letter here, and you can sort of see the ink blots and so on. So it's already a bit of a struggle to do the handwriting, and the cover note is written by Dennis Sciama, at least that's what it says in the notes with the papers in the archive. Right, so that's sort of some of the earlier years material of getting his career started off. We're moving on now to Hawking's first published scientific paper, I think, which is the occurrence of singularities in cosmology. So it's his first work on black holes, working on Einstein's theory of general relativity. And the idea is that huge stars collapse to zero size and infinite density, known as singularities. And it was published in Proceedings of the Royal Society, which is a very prestigious journal. And you can see there's sort of two versions here. So you've got the draft handwritten version, and then you can see there's a later typescript that's got slightly different, you know, corrections. It's not majorly, it's not largely different, but often people, I think, cross these out when they're finished with that section. So I don't know if that was then copied into another copy as well. But I guess the interesting thing, like, for an archivist is starting to compare the different versions of a paper and how they relate to the published work.
Definitely. And this is Hawking's own handwriting at this stage? I
think so. I think it is, yeah. Yeah. Okay. So in 1966, Hawking entered his essay in something called the Adams Prize, which is a prize in Cambridge for physics of a young physics researcher or an early career physics researcher, and you submit an essay, and the best essay wins a prize, and usually it's on a topic as well. So some of the like famous physicists who have won the Adams Prize include people like J.J. Thomson and James Clerk Maxwell. So some of the great names in Cambridge applied mathematics and theoretical physics, basically. And the prize is named after John Couch Adams, who was the astronomer who discovered Neptune. And it was endowed by his college, or members of his college, St. John's College. And this year, the topic was in cosmology. And Hawking's essay just summarized some of his previous work, some of his thesis work, some of the papers that he's written. And they were all referring back to some of Roger Penrose's work, who was doing some interesting new work at the time on, the case of a star collapsing to form a black hole. And so they're all sort of referencing back to that. And the work took place in a really lively network of colleagues. So there was a group in Cambridge, but there were groups in London as well, at King's College and Imperial, and they sort of went to each other's seminars. They also had a lot of visitors. So a highlight of this was the International Gravity and General Relativity Conference, which was held in Imperial College in 1965. And Soviet Union physicists came as well. So they were also working on black holes. So that sort of both local and international collaboration was really important in the mid-1960s for the development of that work.
And during this time, he wins the Adams Prize. And does he win the Adams Prize? Yeah.
Well, actually, Roger Penrose won the prize, but then there were two runners-up. One was Stephen Hawking, and one was Jayant Narlikar, who was one of Hoyle's PhD students as well.
Okay.
But they were all working in cosmology, and in the same kind of network.
And obviously, to a layman on the history of this, Penrose, like Hawking, is a very well-known figure. You hear his name. Is their reputation in Cambridge and wider? Is it being built at this stage? Are people seeing these physicists and saying they're stars of the future, their work is really exceptional, or are they just,
I think Roger Penrose's work was known as the sort of leader in that group in terms of some of the mathematical techniques that he developed, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next item, actually. Yeah. I think Stephen Hawking, he was still forming his career at that time. So the Adams Prize is for emerging writers, I guess. So what we've got over here, actually, it's good that you asked that question, is a paper which is a collaboration between Roger Penrose, who I think won the Nobel Prize last year, a couple of years ago, and a draft figure for the Hawking for their paper together. So again, this was published in the Royal Society Journal, Proceedings of the Royal Society, and they basically characterized black holes as the Big Bang in reverse. And they argued that there would be singularities in the past and the future. And they also pointed out the necessary formation of black holes in the universe. So this draft includes 4 versions of something which is called a Penrose diagram. And they come in different forms, but first attempted by Penrose in 1962, they were developed in the tradition of space-time diagrams, which had been developed back in the 1920s by Minkowski, but also inspired by the idea of impossible objects. So these were impossible objects in art and psychology that Penrose had explored with his father, Lionel Penrose, who was a geneticist. And Penrose diagrams were widely adopted in general relativity and cosmology research and in graduate training because they provided both mathematical rigor and conceptual clarity. So they became very important to Hawking's way of working, mediating communication with students and scientific problems.
We've had a question which is relevant to this stage of Hawking's career, which is, do we know, or do the archives tell us how Hoyle and Hawking got on in that relationship, or does it not come across in the archive?
I haven't seen too much in the archive about it. I have read in one of the biographies that Hawking went to an early seminar that Hoyle gave because Hoyle was supporting the steady state theory of the universe. And Hawking and others were starting to, they were working more around the Big Bang sort of idea. So yeah, I think there were some interesting discussions.
Interesting.
But I haven't found too much in the archive about that from the early years. And I suppose it seems like, Hawking hasn't retained much correspondence, but probably the way they were interacting would have been in person at seminars and so on, as much as in writing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Right. So, Hawking is starting to establish his reputation with some of the papers that he's published. And what we have on this side, and I hope that people will be able to see more of this as well in an image that I've got. But this is the text of a lecture for something called the Les Houches Summer School, which happened in 1972. It's an annual summer school that was set up to sort of re-inspire or reignite scientific institutions in France after World War II. And so, they had a different topic every year. And in 1972, it was black holes. And Hawking, I think, recalled in one of his memoirs that this is where they worked out some of the last remaining problems on black holes. And what's really interesting about this document in terms of the archive is it's probably one of the last extended examples of Hawking's handwriting that is visible in the archive. And if you can see the inserted still image, which I hope my colleagues are able to pop in now, number 6, just in case, you can sort of see that as he's writing the document, he has to alternate with other writers who are helping to produce the document, because obviously it's just a bit too much. So the following year, Hawking submitted a paper to Nature, and what we have in the little blue sort of typescript outgoing correspondence there is a rather immodest letter that was sent with the manuscript of Hawking's first major discovery, which was known later as Hawking radiation, but here the paper is called Black Hole Explosions. And in this paper, Hawking combined approaches from general relativity and quantum theory, which was a new approach to combine those two. And he proposed that particles could escape from black holes, from the event horizon of a black hole, which is the area that surrounds a black hole and through which an observer can't interact. And that implied that the mass of a black hole could decrease, which was contrary to earlier thinking on that topic. And Hawking became a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1974 at the age of 32.
I really like this letter, and as you were alluding to there, Katrina, this immodesty where it says the results reported is rather sensational, which I quite like as a statement. This links to another question that we've had from the audience, where obviously some of Hawking's fame rests on black holes and his work around them. How are eureka moments, like his work on black holes, his understanding of black holes, how are they sort of demonstrated in the archive, if at all, as a eureka moment, or is it a slow build-up of thinking?
I don't think I've got any examples of a eureka moment as such. It's really more him reporting, well, this is what I've found and this is what I've done. And some of those moments are sort of only captured through memoir, I suppose. And it has been sort of written about, some of the times where he said, oh, I was, it took me a long time to go to bed while I was walking upstairs. So I had a long time to think about this. And it is a really interesting question. How do you sort of know when something has been discovered? Well, it's partly the way that it is written about and transferred to other people. And that's when you know that something has happened. I suppose if we had accounts of some of the discussions that took place at some of the conferences, I think he was sort of alluding to that a little bit, saying, at this 1972 conference, we, talked about black holes and settled some of those problems. Yeah.
And is there much that you found so far in the archive? And I realize we've not had it very long and there's still a long way to go to fully understand the archive. We know that other scientists that we held in the archive, such as Darwin, was writing extensively to his colleague. Well, he was writing to everyone to further his work. Is Hawking doing the same, or is it much more within a kind of conference environment that he's doing his thinking when he's not thinking on his own, if that makes sense?
I think the conference is really central, it seems, to theoretical physics at this time, or the symposium, the invited symposium as well. So one thing that I find absolutely fascinating about the way that Hawking worked is he traveled so much, and you do see loads of evidence of this in the archive, although I haven't pulled that up today, because a lot of it's quite mundane, like it's sort of his itineraries and his, his travel arrangements and all that sort of stuff. but it was so difficult for him to travel. At a certain point, he had to travel with an entourage. There were issues around getting batteries onto the plane. It was a total palaver. So but he still did it, and he did it for both scientific purposes and also to promote his books and so on. So I think that's probably part of the answer there. Okay, I'm just going to check on the time. Yeah, we're doing okay. Okay, so this is sort of dating from about 1978, I think, and it's both a talk or the paper, actually. The paper was published in Physics Review, but it's the notes for a paper. But it's also, you can see it was also a talk because it's been put on lecture slides as well. And after, Hawking developed the idea of Hawking radiation, that sort of led physicists into another conundrum. So each problem seemed to pose another problem. And that was the idea that if small black holes could, in theory, evaporate, could the information about the matter that had fallen into them be retrieved? And if it couldn't, that would sort of contradict one of the key principles of quantum mechanics. So it was a bit of a big challenge to the ideas in theoretical physics at the time. And it was the subject of Hawking's 1997 bet against John Preskill. And in 2004, Hawking changed his mind, calling it his biggest blunder. But actually, I think scientists still debate the same questions today. So you can see that the manuscript is written by an assistant. And you can also see the lecture slide here. And as I said before, Hawking traveled a lot. He spoke at many conferences and events internationally. And he was quite well known for using all these slides. And he always had sort of different formats depending on the different technologies that were available to, present lectures and talks over time. Okay, any questions at this? Chugging on.
No, let's carry on.
Okay, so this is actually a document from the University Archive. So this is not part of the Hawking Archive, but I thought it was pertinent to the talk today, or to the show and tell today. It's actually a register which all the university officers of the University of Cambridge have to sign on commencing their employment. And it's believed to be the last time that Hawking signed his name. So it's in 1979, and that's the signature here. I think we've got a still image of that as well. And he'd obviously forgotten to sign in for his previous two roles but then when he became the Lucasian Professor of Mathematics, he did manage to sign it, or they must have got him over to the registry to sign it. It's interesting looking back on some of Hawking's reminiscences about the Lucasian Professor, because when interviewed about it in 1998, he explained that he didn't apply and that he was a bit disappointed that he got the job, although he admitted it's nice to feel that one is in the same position as Newton and Dirac. And he commented, "I hope they get someone good after me." So I thought that was interesting.
That links to one of the questions which says, would his fame has been as great if it wasn't for his condition? But clearly, if he was elected to this position, he was a pretty sizable figure within the field. It's you've just mentioned Newton and Dirac there. This is the top job. Is that fair to say, do you think?
I think it's certainly one of the most prestigious chairs in applied mathematics and theoretical physics. Yes, for sure. I think there's evidence in the archive of his eminence as a scientific researcher.
And he wouldn't have been interacting in all these people, would he, if it wasn't for the importance of his work and it's reflected in the people that he was working with, really, isn't it?
He was definitely a key figure in that cosmology revival, I guess, from the 1960s and interacting with all sorts of other physicists internationally. And it was considered to be quite an exciting time for cosmology as well.
Cool.
Okay. So we're moving on here to A Brief History of Time, which was Hawking's very famous and very sold 25 million copies, I think, book. And it was meant to be a sort of a readable for the general reader account of some of the findings in cosmology, both historically, but also bringing it more up to date with some of these exciting findings that we've been talking about previously. And so what we've got is, as it says here, it says early version of the book in the envelope there. And it's one of the kind of typescript manuscripts. And I think it was written, you know, after he had his tracheostomy and later was able to get his computer generated voice and synthesizer, he was able to work on this computer and produce the manuscript with that. So it sort of is quite amazing, really, to think about all the effort and energy to produce this large manuscript, which was revised many, many times. And you can sort of see over here, there's a bit of correspondence with the New York editor, Peter Gazzardi, and it's in the late stages of the book. So they're just having queries about, you know, copyright and images and acknowledgements and things like that. So the other thing I wanted to mention over here is actually something that isn't part of the Hawking archive, but was purchased by Cambridge University Library in 2018, and it was with the support of a generous donation from Simon Mitten. And it's the first edition and printing of the US edition, which was published by Bantam. The volume is flagged, as you can see, rather inelegantly with post-it notes. And these are pointing out all the errors in the book, and you can see the little red notes there as well. So there were lots of factual errors, and it was missing its dedication and didn't have a contents page. So it was suppressed, and most copies were destroyed and withdrawn. And it's an interesting connection, because Mitten was not only Hawking's editor at Cambridge University Press, he was also the administrator in the Institute of Theoretical Physics when Hawking was working there in the late 60s and early 70s. And Mitten says it was he who advised Hawking that his sales would diminish in proportion to the number of equations that were in his book. So.
Do you get a sense from up until the publication of A Brief History in Time, but really from the archive of his, clearly had a belief in the importance of public science, about the public reception of science and the public understanding of science, which is something incredibly relevant today. Do you get a sense of his belief in that through, you know, until before A Brief History of Time, through the archive? Are we not quite there yet in terms of the cataloguing and stuff to understand that? Or is it?
That's an interesting question. I suppose I don't really get a huge sense of that. But as you say, there may be more material in there. He was definitely somebody who was disseminating ideas widely and was into the concept of interacting with as many people as possible and disseminating those ideas. But I think perhaps some of the earlier stuff that I showed is really more about the physics community. And maybe this was a change. Certainly after the success of A Brief History of Time, he wrote many popular books. And there's lots of evidence of all of that in the archive in terms of both the manuscripts or the typescripts or the computer generated scripts, but also the contracts and all of that kind of thing.
No.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Okay. So this is what we've got here is the 22nd episode of the 10th series of The Simpsons. And it's the first in which Hawking made a guest appearance. Obviously, The Simpsons is the comedic cartoon program, if anyone hasn't seen it, based in a fictional town called Springfield in the United States. And Hawking is playing himself in this. It first aired in the USA on the Fox network in 1999. And in this episode, Lisa Simpson, who is the daughter of Bart Simpson, the main character, is invited to join a branch of Mensa, which is an organization for people with a higher IQ. And the group takes over Springfield, but it's not very successful. The people rebel, and Hawking rescues Lisa from an angry mob. So what I find really interesting about this is that although his voice was computer generated and synthesized, it was his voice, and he recorded his own lines in person, you know, generating them himself. So just as any other actor or part in the series, and that seems to be characteristic as well. So another funny thing about this particular item or this particular version of the script is that in the actual broadcast script, Homer proposes a theory of a donut-shaped universe. But that's actually missing from this particular script. So it must have kind of, you know, they must have developed the ideas as they went along.
Yeah.
So I'm yet to find out what the story is of who suggested adding that and how it came about. But hopefully we'll find out more.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see. what is revealed with that.
Yeah, okay. So, all right. Obviously, after a brief history of time, and Hawking starts to gain fame as a sort of celebrity scientist and science writer. And, he gets all sorts of invitations to do all sorts of things. He visits the Vatican and, he's invited to all sorts of things, basically. So in 2000, he met Bill and Hillary Clinton when he was invited to deliver the second in a series of Millennium evening lectures in the White House. And they were basically sort of lectures, about the future of society by eminent people, both Americans and international people. And interestingly, Hillary Clinton, in her greeting, said it was the largest gathering in the audience of 250, it was the largest gathering of physicists ever in the White House, which I find quite difficult to believe if you think about the history of physics in the history of the US. But there you go. So I guess few receive birthday greetings from the president, but here they are. And Hawking was also awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Barack Obama in 2009, and that's the highest civilian honor in the USA.
And celebrity is the wrong word, but for the presidents of the United States of America. But is there much material in the archive of very famous people outside the world of physics writing to him? Does that exist in there?
Yeah, I mean, there's other examples of that as well, with political figures. And, he got invited to lots of official kind of functions and received so many honors and awards, so he did start to sort of circulate outside the world of just science, if that makes sense.
Absolutely does, yeah.
Both the sort of popular world, but also the powerful world, the political world. So that segues quite nicely to our next our next item then, which is this little badge, which I hope you can see here. I actually, when I was unpacking the archive in March, I found this little box and I wondered, what's that doing there? I mean, there's quite a few objects of various kinds in the archive, although the primary collection of artifacts has been gifted to the Science Museum as part of this gift to the nation. But I found this one, and it's a campaign for nuclear disarmament badge. And not knowing too much about it at the time, I sort of wondered, well, is this here by on purpose, or is it here by accident? Why is this object here? And I looked up a little bit online, and Stephen Hawking, he was against Trident, and he was part of Scientists for Global Responsibility and so on. But interestingly, as I was going through the archive, much later, I did find another document, which I hope you can see as a still. You can see a section of it as a still, which is an open letter from Jane and Stephen Hawking in 1981. And they're calling on all their friends in East and West to set up local groups to sort of lobby politicians and campaign against nuclear weapons, and it's called Newnham Against the Bomb.
All right, interesting.
So it's very local to us.
We've had a question about what is the most surprising thing you found? Is this badge the most surprising thing you found?
I mean, I don't know if it was surprising, and maybe if I knew more, it wouldn't have surprised me. But it's not so much things that surprise you; it's just being able to connect everything up to everything else in the archive, which is the real challenge. So you'll see something, you'll think, well, how does that fit in? Where does that fit into his published work? Who was he working with? What was he doing? Why was he, in Spain or Chile or, and it's that, I think it's that sort of detective work of trying to match it all up that's most interesting for many archivists anyway. And I hope that we can see this still image, because it's very faint. It's a pencil sketch, but I'm hoping that our colleagues can pop that in for us now. And this envisions a wheelchair modifications to address the tiny restaurant problem.
All right.
So you've got a little image of Hawking, or a figure sitting in a wheelchair, in the tiny restaurant, trying to squeeze into that tiny space. It's got the food sort of there steaming off the top. And I guess I just dropped that in to say, Hawking's work was mediated by the most advanced assistive technology, really. And they were also always trying to develop it and make it better and more convenient. And I think he also wanted some of that to be more widely available. Okay, so We're now up to some of the last items that I've pulled out for the show and tell today.
Should we just hold this one up for the camera just so...
yeah, we're having trouble seeing now. So how's that? We're getting that. Well, okay. So this is basically a script for A Theory of Everything, which was the 2014 biopic about Stephen Hawking, in which Eddie Redmayne starred as Stephen Hawking and won an Oscar, I think, for his performance. And I suppose, you know, it's just a symbol that so many books and media programs and TV programs and, you know, articles have been written about Stephen Hawking, and there's lots and lots of that in the archive. So if you're wanting to look at how, you know, his scientific celebrity is sort of reported in the media and, you know, propagated through all sorts of different, you know, stories, then there's plenty in the archive there. And I found it quite interesting when I was looking back to some of the earlier correspondence about how Hawking felt about this, because in March 79, he was approached by a writer saying, I'd like to write a book about you. So this is before he wrote Brief History of Time. So he must have, I'm getting back to your earlier question, aren't I? Because he must have had some notoriety even back then. And Hawking had replied, I've had quite a lot of publicity recently and I've not enjoyed it. To have a whole book about me would be rather too much.
And here we have with a whole film.
Yeah, well, not just one. So
we've got a question about the film where the line cosmology is theology for atheists is used. Is that apocryphal, or do we know that he used that line?
I don't know. I think that I might have to take that one on notice, I'm afraid.
Fair enough.
Just say that line again. Cosmology is
theology for atheists.
Okay. Well, maybe he did. It's a good line, isn't it? Yeah. I don't know. I'll have to check that out. But I think the film script, wasn't it, was based on Jane Hawking's own account.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's where a lot of the material came from. Okay. So I thought I'm sort of drawing to the close of my items that I've selected for today. And I thought we'd sort of end where we started, which is with the childhood letter. And this one is from Connecticut in the United States. And it's basically a 10-year-old fifth grader who is writing to Stephen Hawking, saying he's got a special project that he has to do, and can be on any topic that's of interest to him. And he's heard that Hawking is quite good at astronomy. So again, this is getting back to your point, because this is also 1979. And, you know, so this kid in Connecticut obviously knows who Stephen Hawking is and is able to write to him and everything. And he says, oh, I'd be very proud to cite you as a human reference, which I thought was kind of fascinating, because it kind of gives this idea of Stephen Hawking as this, like, you know, have you heard of the Human Library, which is a real thing in Scandinavia, where you can go in and you can talk to a person about their life.
Yeah.
I sort of got this idea of Stephen Hawking as this kind of human library or database that could sort of, you know, communicate knowledge about the universe through space, but also through his archive through time. So that's quite a sweet letter. That's
absolutely fascinating. And this is my first opportunity to see the archive. With COVID and being locked down, I've not had a chance to get in and see it, and it's absolutely amazing. Some of the things you've brought out, Katrina. We have some questions. If you are willing.
Too hard, please.
A couple actually on experimental physics, and do we know if he participated in any kind of experimental physics while he was working?
I mean, I suppose if he did physics in Oxford, he probably did have to do some prac work, but I don't think he did a lot of it. But as far as I know, no, he was never involved from doctoral studies on in experimental physics at all. Okay. And that was a choice that he made before he knew that he was going to have challenges with coordination and so on. I mean, it's an interesting thing about the relationship between experimental and theoretical physics in cosmology at that time, because some would argue that it was some of the observations in radio astronomy. So, for example, background microwave radiation seemed to provide some evidence of the Big Bang, and then, you know, there were discoveries of stars or radiation that looked like, you know, they were inferred to be black holes. So it seemed like in the 1960s, that there were some observational experiments that were starting to bring back evidence that some of these theoretical entities actually existed. But as some historians have pointed out, there was actually very little sort of detailed correspondence between the two.
Really
one was just sort of happening, and it provided this context that made some of these things seem more feasible or plausible, but they weren't actually directly connected. And in fact, a lot of the developments in cosmology were around mathematical techniques, for example.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. And a kind of archive question now. When you kind of look at the Hawking papers, and we've spoken briefly about that a lot of the papers of Sir Isaac Newton are held at the University Library, and a huge 9,000 letters of correspondence and notebooks from Darwin are also held at the University Library. Does this archive raise similar issues for an archivist, or are there other three archives very different when you compare them?
I think they have some commonalities. I mean, the most obvious one is sort of a retrospective one. Well, not really, actually. No, it's not a retrospective one for any of those figures. So the most obvious one is the fame and celebrity and well-known nature of these scientists and their work, and that creates lots of myths and ideas about people, that circulate very, very widely. And perhaps sometimes things in the archive will contradict that, or they'll make it more complicated, or perhaps the idea that they were working alone, you actually see, they were working with lots of other people, or that they were maybe even if not working with other people, sort of reacting to other things that were happening. So I guess an archive can make quite a simple story a little bit more complicated sometimes. So that's one aspect. I suppose another thing that is a sort of common thread, but has three different instances really, is the importance of writing as a tool to each of them, and how each of them adapted, in different times and technologies to working, through the physical and mathematical and biological problems that they were working on. So, Newton kept all of these kind of notes, and they were mainly for himself, and they were sort of ways of organizing his ideas and recording his experiments and his readings and all of that sort of thing. Darwin is much more of a sort of correspondent, so he's actually getting lots and lots of data and information from other people all around the world to help to formulate and find evidence and so on for his ideas, but also to share his ideas. And then, the Hawking archive is comes at a really interesting time. So it's at a time of big changes in media, times of big changes with the digital age as well. So, and throw in sort of the medical condition on top of that, and you've got a really fascinating account of, communication, mediation, how people are, working with assistive technology. So there's different kinds of writing and communication techniques that produce the archive. But I think in each case, that process of writing or recording is still really important to each of them.
And just on the Hawking archive in particular, most of the things we have here are on paper. Are you having to grapple with, I don't know, floppy disk or that kind of material? Does that come in with the archive as well? Do you have to?
Yeah. So there's a lot of video is one thing. So there's a really interesting element of, I guess, media and performance there. And we haven't started to look at any of those. And of course, they'll have really interesting copyright questions around them as well, because a lot of them were probably produced for different media companies and productions and so on. So we haven't really started to look into that yet. But it's interesting because I've seen other archives where quite a well-known figure will start to sort of accumulate, or their office will start to accumulate all of the recordings of their performances that are out there and bring them together in archives. So there's an evidence of this here as well. And of course, Hawking's digital archive was very important to himself and his own way of working. But it's actually not part of the acceptance in lieu gift, which has happened in March. And whilst we'd very much like to help with preserving the digital archive, I think that's all still to be worked out, to be investigated. It's certainly a crucial element, really, in terms of understanding the whole fond or the whole collection and the way that everything works together.
Yeah, interesting. It is obviously, as an archivist, you are increasingly having to grapple with these multi-format archives which are coming into the building all the time, and that's something which the library is, working on very hard, isn't it? How do we preserve this stuff and then make it available, which is the key thing. That's
right. And, even in the, there's been a fair amount of work done in digital preservation, but I think the answers are not totally obvious across the whole sector. So it's still a bit of an experimental space in terms of how best to preserve and to make these documents accessible. And of course, there's many other issues that are present in paper archives as well, but perhaps become more difficult to manage in digital archives. So things like data protection and copyright, for example. So there's all sorts of legal and social issues too, ethical issues.
Oh, interesting. I think we've got time for a couple more quick questions. Okay. Is there, we touched on Hawking's relationship with Roger Penrose. Yeah. Is there much in the archive around that, someone's asked?
Around his collaboration with Penrose? A bit. There's not a lot of correspondence, I don't think. But that being said, there are many, many boxes of correspondence from the 1970s and 80s that we haven't been through yet. So it may turn out that there is more. But I have a feeling that people who knew each other quite well and were quite close didn't really correspond that much, because they just sort of talked to each other. There's probably some evidence of some other collaborative work, and certainly things like, some of the symposium lists of people who are coming, they were both, invited to those. And so you get sort of evidence that they were interacting, definitely. And there's other examples in there. For example, there's correspondence with Jim Hartle, who Hawking collaborated with in the late 70s and early 1980s. And he came for quite frequent visits to Cambridge in the Department of Applied Mathematics and Theoretical Physics. And you can sort of see at least setting up the time for them to come, but you don't necessarily know what they worked on together. And then out the other side of it, you see these papers being produced. So
I always think that one of the remarkable things about Cambridge through the collegiate system, but also in buildings like this, is clearly conversations are going on where people are making sort of major research decisions, and it's not captured, because it is just a conversation over a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, and that's happening all the time.
I think this is the kind of archive where it's quite hard. I mean, it's 120 boxes, and this is just what I've managed to sort of pull together, I suppose, without the archive being catalogued. But once we start drilling down into the details of every document, every file, every folder, and start to get a picture of how it all works together, I think you map all these little different points, and you can't see the whole picture until you sort of start to fill it in. It's a bit like a puzzle.
That's amazing. I think on that puzzle we have run out of time. So thanks, Katrina, for taking us through some of the remarkable papers in the Hawking archive, which you've got the exciting job working through over future years. And thanks to everyone for joining us here at the University Library. Sadly, we couldn't have had this in person, but it was amazing that so many of you could join us today. So thank you very much for coming.